Welcome back to the next class. In this class, we will focus on Weber's methodology of social sciences. And I must have mentioned in the previous class that Weber is credited with making a very important intervention in the development of methodology for social sciences, especially that of sociology. Along with his substantive contributions to other fields, Weber's intervention to methodological debate, his very forceful argument that sociology cannot be seen as a science like physics or chemistry became extremely influential, and so he's rightly credited as a person who kind of changed the very positivist orientation of sociology, and as a very important champion of this anti-positivist turn that sociology undertook in the early 20th century. So Weber is credited with to have rescued sociology from a positivist orientation. So we have discussed it several times earlier. Sociology was conceived of as a science. Auguste Comte called sociology as social physics. Durkheim wanted to construct a sociology exactly modeled after science. Okay, so from that kind of an orientation of sociology wanting to be seen and known as science, Weber argued that sociology need not be seen as a science, and he did not consider it as a weakness of the discipline. Rather, he argued that the social reality that you are dealing with is more complex than the natural reality or natural phenomena, and it requires more diverse kind of approach and not strictly a scientific approach. So he foregrounded the distinction of human action as being different from mere behavior, where the intention of the actor is vital. So he argued that you can't really study for example, when two molecules interact, okay, something happens, and we never bothered about, we don't really care about under what circumstances. Of course, you talk about the physical circumstances, but you never think about the intentions of these molecules when they interact with each other. Okay, or a major natural phenomenon like a volcanic eruption or a explosion of a supernova takes place. Okay, but a scientist doesn't have to really worry about what this supernova was thinking about when it was about to explode. Okay, or about a black hole, or about any of such kind of natural phenomenon that you think about. A scientist does not have to really think about the motive behind a particular action or an incident. They are mere incidences, they are mere processes that are happening on the basis of certain natural laws. But in the case of human society, it is much more extremely complicated. Okay, animal society itself is complicated, but human society is much more complicated because we simply do not behave as per certain pre-programmed genetic codes. Of course, this genetics is important. That is why there is a very specific genetic predisposition to people's behaviors and actions and everything. Okay, we have our natural instincts, our biological instincts. We have our our emotions of freedom, of fear, of happiness, hunger, sexual urge. Everything is there. But we human beings, life is more complicated because we have trained ourselves. Okay, we are trained to deal with these emotions, and these emotions are important, these ideas are important because these intentions are important. We simply do not behave like some of the lower order animals behave. Okay, some of the on the basis of certain stimulus and behavior. Okay, there are quite a lot of animal psychology, which clinical psychology, which tries to explain behavior of animals on this particular basis. Okay, people or animals behave on the basis of certain stimulus, so it becomes predictable that if you give this particular stimulus, the animal will come up with this particular stimulus. Okay, so stimulus and response kind of scenario. But we can't apply that to human society, that, because we human beings respond very differently to different kind of stimuli. Okay, we don't do it in a same manner. So hence, mere observation and data collection will not be sufficient unless the researcher enters into the realms of meanings attached by the actor to the actions. So this is the point that I have been repeatedly, laboring about. Unless you enter into the realm of the meanings of the actors and try to understand why he or she does it, okay, it doesn't make any sense to the observer. Okay, one of the usual examples that I used to give is that if you go to a temple, you will see the priest dropping the offerings to the hands of the devotees from a distance. Okay, he will not place it in the hands of a devotee. He will not touch the devotee. He will ensure that, or even the devotees will ensure that they don't want to touch the priest in most of the temples. Of course, there are exceptions where devotees are allowed even to touch the idol. But in most of the temples, the priests stay at a distance and simply throw these offerings to the hands of the devotees. So for somebody who does not understand the cultural underpinnings of this particular action, it's very difficult to interpret this whole scenario, or they might interpret it in very differently. Okay, but unless you get into the realms of meanings, a shared set of meanings, shared both by the priest as well as by the devotees, by everybody who is present, that the priest is supposedly at a much higher state of ritual purity because he is touching the idol. Idol is nothing but the place where the god resides. Okay, so the priest is supposed to be at a higher state of ritual purity, and the devotees are at much lower state of ritual purity, and through touch pollution can pass from the devotee to that of the priest. So that should not happen. So that is why this physical distance is maintained. So that means you are getting into the realms of ideas, you are getting into the realms of meanings, and that is what Weber argues is something extremely important. Okay, in another example, you see a husband beating up his wife. Okay, so unless you try to understand why does this husband do that, okay, why does he think that it is right on his part, okay, under what kind of cultural context that he tries to derive the legitimacy for his action, you will not be able to see why that kind of a scenario exists. So that leads to what became later known as the phenomenological theories on sociology, greatly indebted to Weber. So that emerged as an extremely important important branch of knowledge, branch of social theory or philosophical theory known as phenomenology. That you are getting into the realm of meanings. Okay, you are getting into the realm of meanings, and these meanings are important for social sciences. Now, relevance of values, humans as active players in the social, unlike the depiction of Durkheim. So Weber quite disagreed with Durkheim in terms of the ideas about how active human beings are in the construction of social reality. So I mentioned in the previous class that Durkheim had a very negative, or had a very pessimistic understanding about the agency of human beings. He believed that human beings can't really do much about changing the society, rather they have to simply obey the society in which they live. Because he argued that the social facts are so overbearing, they are so overarching, that human beings will have to simply accept that. But Weber does not agree with that. Weber and a host of other scholars who follow these phenomenological theories, they believe that human beings are capable of fashioning, they are able to create the kind of society in which they live. The social is actively created. Human beings actively take part in the creation of the social around them. So this is a very important turning point. This is a very important different direction that Weber provides to the discipline of sociology. In 1904, Weber posed a fundamental question. In what sense are there objectively valid truths in those disciplines concerned with social and cultural phenomena? Okay, this is a very fundamental question. Okay, and on what basis, in what sense are there objectively valid truths in disciplines that are concerned with social and cultural phenomena? How can you say that this is the truth about society? Okay, this is the truth about economy, or this is the truth about the political phenomenon. This is the truth, because this very term truth, objectively valid truth, is a very difficult claim. Okay? It's a very difficult claim. It's very difficult to establish the proof for that claim. that it is objective, it is truth. And for a religious leader, this hardly matters. You know that because they only need to claim that, nobody will ask them the question. And even if somebody asks them the evidence, they will revert back to their theology to explain, to provide evidences. It becomes a kind of a circuitry kind of an argument. So first, his depiction of the problem of values in sociological research is shown. This was the central methodological issue for Weber. If sociology were to be a true science of society, he believed it has to be objective. Okay, so he brought in this whole idea of values in society, and he agreed that sociology has to be an objective science, but this objectivity must be in terms of keeping the research objective. Okay, not that it is not concerned with the subjective values. Okay, it has to be objectively concerned with the subjective values of the actors. Second, he thought that every science requires a conceptual map, an inventory of the key concepts describing the phenomenon being studied, and he began to develop such a system of concepts, labeling them as ideal types. So ideal type is a very important methodological tool popularized by Weber. So Weber argued that when you try to study a particular social phenomenon, you must have a kind of a conceptual category. You must have a conceptual construct to study about it. Okay, and ideal type is we are discussing that. I think we will discuss it later. Ideal type is a kind of a construct which we think that is a kind of a perfect construct about a social phenomenon. And you know that this ideal type never exists. This perfect scenario never exists. But that helps you to compare a kind of an empirical example with that. Maybe for example, an ideal type of a student. Okay, what is an ideal type of a student? And different people will come with different ideas that he or she has to be studious, and then has to be frugal, they have to be highly disciplined, motivated, hardworking, a host of. So if you put all these qualities into one entity, that becomes the ideal type. Okay, but you know that in reality it's very difficult to find a student who fulfills all such kind of characters. So this ideal type helps you to compare an existing example with that of this construct, and then see what is the kind of a difference. So Weber argued that sociological inquiry should be objective, or to use his term, value free. That researchers' personal values and economic interest should not affect the process of social scientific analysis. This I mentioned even in the previous class. Okay, so a social scientist is a product of a society. He or she is a product of a particular cultural context, a particular political and economic context. So a person, when he or she grows up as an individual, he or she also imbibes a lot of values, ideas, ideological positions like anybody else. Okay, and from such a position, he or she tries to go and study in another society. He or she should try their maximum level best not to get influenced by their own personal values. Okay, so the personal values and economic interest should not affect the process of social scientific analysis. In Weber's eyes, sociology should not be a moral science. It is not possible to state scientifically which norm, values or patterns of action are correct or best, but rather it is only possible to describe them objectively. And this is yet another very important point. Okay, he is very clear that you have to keep away from the world of morality. And especially you need to keep in mind that he was talking in the context of the European context there, where the influence of Catholic Church was so much so influential in every discipline and its pedagogy. Okay, so you need to keep this moral aspect away. It is not possible to state scientifically which norms or values or patterns of action are correct or best. It's very difficult to say that. And remember, Durkheim has a different position. Okay, Durkheim has no issue in describing certain thing as pathological. We saw that in the previous classes. Okay, Durkheim labels certain things as good, certain things as bad, certain things as pathological, where Weber does not do that. Okay, so increasing divorce rates, is it good or bad? It's very difficult question. Okay, for a person from a religious background, it's very easy to say that increasing divorce rates are really bad. Society has become corrupt. Everybody has become so selfish, and it's everything is gone. That kind of a lamentation can be seen from a religious leader. But for a social scientist, it's a much more complicated scenario. Okay, an increased divorce rate is an illustration of a host of other very positive formations, very positive dynamics on various ways. So what ought to be the sphere of values and what is the sphere of science, normative and positive? So what ought to be is the sphere of values. Okay, how should you lead? What should be the position of women in society? Okay, what should people do? Okay, so this ought to be, this normative and positive. Normative and positive is very different. So what ought to be is the sphere of values and what is the sphere of science. So sociology as a science, Weber argues, must be concerned with the whole question of what is, or the question of positive. Okay, the first and foremost objective of a sociologist is to analyze the kind of existing scenario, not to prescribe solutions or policies out of hand. The new science reflects an ongoing historical process in which magic and other forms of inherited wisdom becomes less acceptable as means of explaining events. Weber referred to this change as the process of rationalization. In a rationalized discipline, values should not affect the research process, but they remain relevant. Okay, so the new science reflects an ongoing historical process in which magic and other forms of inherited wisdom become less acceptable as means of explaining events. I mentioned that in several of the previous classes. Okay, we don't really look forward to supernatural explanations. We are not convinced about the say wishes of God. God wanted to create it, that's why it is created. Or we don't believe in supernatural forces. We don't believe in magic being a force that can alter our life or that of the world. So we know that all these stories are stories created when people were ignorant, okay, about the exact functioning of the universe. All these are the products of human imagination. Okay, so this realization, Weber calls it as the process of rationalization. You try to reason it out. You don't attribute the reason to some other higher entities and then think that, okay, this God or a supernatural force must have decided thing in a particular manner and then let us accept it. Now we realize that human rationality, human intellect can be used to make sense of your own society. Okay, you can make a sense of, you can use your senses to understand the society around you, the world around you, the solar system around you, the universe around you. You can use your rationality, you can use your intellect to understand the history. Okay, you can reshape the present and you can refashion the past. And this process he calls it as the process of rationalization. In a rationalized discipline, values should not affect the research process, but they remain relevant. Weber rejected the search for general laws in favor of historical theories that provide an interpretative understanding of social action and a causal explanation of its causes and consequences. A search for universal law necessarily excludes from consideration important and unique historical events. This is another very, very important point. We know that earlier social scientists, they were so preoccupied in formulating larger laws. So that is why we have Comte talking about law of 3 stages, that every society must pass through from theological to metaphysical to positive. Okay, he presented as if it is something similar to a law of gravity or law of relativity or any such kind of laws that you will find in natural sciences. So Weber argues against it. He very categorically argued that you can't have any social laws. You can't have any laws in social science as accurate as they are in the natural sciences. Why? It is because but rather he wanted to favor the historical theories that provide interpretative understandings of social action and a causal explanation of its causes and consequences. Okay, so as I mentioned, the history plays an extremely important role in defining, in shaping certain societies in different manner. So these historical contexts are extremely important. When you talk about historical context, it's also about the social history, economic history, political history, and geography and whatnot. So if you want to create a larger theory, an all-encompassing theory, an overarching theory, then you lose out all these peculiarities. You lose out all these specificities, and that becomes a futile exercise according to Weber. I'm quoting a very important passage from Weber. For the knowledge of historical phenomena in their concreteness, the most general laws, because they are most devoid of content, are also the least valuable. Okay, the more you make the laws appear as general, okay, they are most devoid of content. Because you know that the history of Indian subcontinent is entirely different from the history of Europe, which is entirely different from the history of America or that of Africa. So if you want to create a law that encompasses all these different continents, then you finally end up in creating a very large, huge theory, but which becomes very hollow. The more comprehensive the validity or scope of a term, the more it leads us away from the richness of reality. Since in order to include the common elements of the largest possible number of phenomena, it must necessarily be as abstract as possible and hence devoid of content. In the social sciences, the knowledge of the universal or general is never valuable in itself. This is an extremely important point. Okay, extremely important point, and a fundamental difference between natural sciences and social sciences. A fundamental point of difference which makes this social science more complex and complicated than that of the natural science. Yeah, he comes back to this idea of ideal type we just briefly mentioned earlier. So to study social phenomenon, Weber argued that it is necessary to have a description of the key element of a phenomena. The goal is to describe forms of actions and patterns of social organizations while seeking to identify the historical causes of these forms of patterns. So if you want to study a particular phenomenon, you need to necessarily have a description of the key elements of the phenomenon. You need to identify what are its most important prominent features, and you need to describe them. For example, Weber's ideal type of bureaucracy is very famous. It's very popular. We will discuss it in the next week. So in Weberian ideal type, you get a complete picture of a perfect form of bureaucracy. You will see how bureaucracy must be in its ideal type. I hope that you are familiar with this term. I gave you the example of an ideal type of a student, okay, or ideal type of a teacher, ideal type of a politician, ideal type of a school, ideal type of a university. Okay, so these are all conceptual construct where you want to overemphasize on certain features what you think as something extremely important. An ideal type or pure type summarizes the basic properties of social phenomena, which in turn can help the search for its historical causes. So these constructs are not historical processes, but rather they are historical constructs. So this ideal type will help you to trace out the historical evolution of these concepts. And this is the definition of ideal type. I just thought I will mention it here for your benefit. An ideal type is formed by the one-sided accentuation of one or more points of view and by the synthesis of a great many diffuse, discrete, more or less present and occasionally absent concrete individual phenomena, which are arranged according to those one-sidedly emphasized viewpoints into a unified analytical construct. It's a conceptual purity. This mental construct cannot be found anywhere in reality. So as I gave you this example of an ideal type of a student, okay, such a perfect student never exists in reality. Okay, we will never find such a perfect student, all complete student where you will not have any negative things about it, which he or she is not lacking in anything. That perfection is something impossible to find anywhere, but such a mental construct, as Weber says, is something very important in social science analysis. So he talks about two types of ideal type. One is this historical ideal type. Historical event can be described by analytically accentuating their key components. For example, in Weber's famous analysis of the spirit of capitalism, he drew up a list of features of this belief system. Once the essence or pure form of this belief system is highlighted, then it becomes possible to seek the causes of the emergence of this distinctive historical event. Okay, so he says that you can create an ideal type for a historical development, trying to understand, trying to identify the most important feature or quality of that particular time, and then try to understand how it evolved over a period in time. And he gives you this example of the spirit of capitalism. Okay, we will discuss this in more detail. I think I will spend at least 1 or 2 sessions to try to understand his argument about this very popular book, The Spirit of Capitalism, Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism. So there he analyzes the reason for the emergence of capitalism, which he talks about as the spirit of capitalism, and where he has employed this use of historical ideal type. And second one, he talks about this general ideal type, where he wanted to make generalizations about generic social phenomena. This desire led him to formulate ideal types of phenomena that are always present in human action. These ideal types do not describe historic events, but rather they accentuate certain key properties of actors, actions, and social organizations in general. So it's not about the historical things, it's about the contemporary society. And his ideal types of social actions, we will see that again in the coming classes. He talks about 3 major types of social actions which are informed by certain kind of values. So they are all ideal types. We know that people simply do not, for example, when he talks about traditional social action, okay, he's talking about how the loyalty towards tradition or commitment towards tradition becomes the most important force behind people's action. But we know that to segregate that or to delimit a particular action and then to say that it is purely from a traditional point of view is very difficult. These types of actions classify behavior by visualizing its 4 pure forms. Okay, although Weber knew that these actual situations would not perfectly reflect these concepts, they provided a common reference to points of comparison. Okay, that is, a variety of empirical cases can be systematically compared with one another and with the ideal type. In this case, the type of social action. So he talks about charismatic. He talks about value, different kind of value orientations. He talks about traditional action. He talks about value rational action. He talks about instrumental rational action. So we are discussing it in the coming class more detail. But keep it in mind that each of these constructs are examples of this ideal type constructs, and he knows that these pure forms do not exist. Okay, but more or less you will be able to categorize all forms of human actions into these 3 or 4 categories, so that you will be able to compare. For example, you will be able to compare actions which are motivated by instrumental rational action with that of value rational action. Okay, why do some people do certain things in a very stupid manner? Okay, seemingly stupid manner. Why do people sacrifice their own life for a particular cause? And that action is very different from why certain people do things in a very, very calculative manner, trying to maximize the benefit and pleasure for them. Okay, so human actions, the way in which people act, why do people act in different ways, what kind of reasons people attribute to their own actions, they are all very different, very, very diverse. But Weber argued that we will be able to classify, you will be able to come up with larger classifications based on these ideal typical constructs, so that you will be able to classify human actions into different categories. Okay, so let us stop here, and we will continue with this discussion on Weber in the coming classes. Okay, thank you.